In 1893, the University of Pennsylvania's Babylonian section catalogued a fragment from Nippur as CBS 10673, a 6-column Sumerian tablet dated to approximately 1600 BCE. For decades it was classified as another flood narrative, grouped with the Eridugenesis, shelved beside familiar accounts of divine wrath and rising waters. But when Thorkild Jacobsen published his full transliteration in 1981, he noted something the catalogue description had missed. The tablet did not say the flood was sent to destroy humanity, it said humanity was preserved deliberately. The flood was sent to destroy something else. The tablet says what? The standard account of the Sumerian flood fits on a single tablet and requires no specialized training to understand. The gods created humanity to do their labor. Humanity multiplied. Humanity became loud. The noise disturbed Enlil, chief among the Anunnaki, the council of senior gods who administered the earth. Enlil proposed extermination. The assembly agreed. One god dissented. Enki, lord of fresh waters and wisdom, warned a single man, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Akkadian, to build a vessel, seal it with bitumen, load it with the seed of all living things, and wait. The flood came, the world was scoured, the man survived, humanity began again. This is the version taught in every ancient Near Eastern studies program from Philadelphia to Munich. It is the version reproduced in survey textbooks and referenced in comparative mythology courses when the Genesis account of Noah is traced to its Mesopotamian antecedent. It is clean, coherent, and satisfying. It is also, according to the oldest textual evidence, incomplete in ways that change at what the flood was for. The Eridugenesis, dated to approximately 1600 BCE and preserved on a Sumerian tablet now catalogued as ECBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is the oldest known flood narrative. Thorkild Jacobsen's 1981 translation in the Journal of Biblical Literature remains the standard academic reference. The tablet is damaged. Roughly 2/3 of the text is lost. What survives includes the creation of humanity, the founding of the first cities, and the decision to send the flood. But the surviving lines describing the divine rationale for the flood do not use the Sumerian word for noise. The word in the Atrahasis epic, the Akkadian version composed centuries later, is hubaru, meaning clamour or uproar. This is the basis for the standard interpretation. Humanity was too noisy. Enlil could not sleep, he sent the flood. But the Eridugenesis, the older text, the Sumerian original, uses different language in the fragmentary lines preceding the flood decree. The legible portions describe a condition among humanity that the gods found intolerable, but the surviving vocabulary points not to sound but to a state of being. The Sumerian term in the damaged passage has been read by multiple scholars, including Miguel Seville at the Oriental Institute, as relating to mixture or contamination rather than acoustic disturbance. This distinction has been noted in the academic literature but not pursued. The reason is straightforward. The tablet is too damaged for definitive reading, and no Assyriologist builds a career on a contested word in a broken line. But the distinction matters because it changes the flood from a reaction to an irritant into a response to a condition, something wrong with humanity itself, or something wrong within the human population that required elimination. The Atrahasis epic provides a second anomaly that the standard reading absorbs without explaining. The text describes 3 attempts by Enlil to reduce the human population before resorting to the flood. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each time Enki intervenes, teaching humanity countermeasures. The standard interpretation frames this as a narrative pattern, escalating divine frustration met by divine cunning. But read operationally, the sequence describes something else. It describes targeted attempts to reduce a population, each time thwarted by a god who had access to the population and chose to protect it. Enlil was not randomly angry, he was trying to eliminate something specific. Enki was not randomly merciful, he was protecting something specific. The Anunnaki Council, as described across multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts, functioned less like a pantheon and more like a governing body with competing factions, jurisdictional authority, and policy disagreements. Enlil held executive authority. Enki held technological and biological authority. He was credited in the Atrahasis epic with designing the human body, mixing clay with the blood of a slaughtered god named Wi'ilu to create the first workers. The word used for this creation is not birth, it is nindim, which means to plan or to design. Humanity was an engineered labour force. Enki was the engineer. When Enlil declared the flood, the text says Enki was bound by oath not to warn humanity directly. He circumvented this by speaking to a reed wall, knowing Atrahasis would overhear. This is presented in every commentary as a clever trick, but the trick has a structural implication that is rarely examined. Enki did not simply warn Atrahasis to flee. He gave specific instructions for what to bring. The seed of all living things, craftsman, knowledge. The instructions read less like emergency evacuation and more like a preservation protocol, a curated selection of biological and intellectual material chosen for survival, while everything else was left to drown. If the flood was divine punishment for noise, Enki's response is disproportionate. Saving one family suffices for narrative mercy. Saving seed stocks, craft knowledge, and biological specimens suggests something else. It suggests Enki knew the flood would not merely kill people, it would erase the conditions under which certain things existed, and he selected what would carry forward and what would not. The planned nature of the survival raises the question the standard account cannot answer. If the Anunnaki unanimously decreed humanity's destruction, and if the purpose was total annihilation, then Enki's elaborate preservation protocol is treason. But the text does not treat it as treason. After the flood, Enki faces no punishment. The council reconvenes, humanity is re-established. The gods resume receiving offerings. The system restarts as if the flood was not a failure but a success, as if what needed to be destroyed was destroyed, and what needed to survive was already on the boat. The flood worked, not because humanity died, but because something within the human population was eliminated. Humanity was the medium, the target was something else. And the oldest Sumerian text, the one with the damaged lines and the contested vocabulary, contains the word that the later Akkadian version replaced with noise. The original word pointed to contamination. Something had contaminated the human population that the gods, or at least Enlil's faction, decided could not be allowed to continue. The flood was not punishment, it was surgery, and the boat was not rescue. It was the clean sample, preserved by the engineer who had designed the organism in the first place, c'est-vivre, so that after the contaminated stock was drowned, the uncontaminated line could begin again. The question then is what contaminated them, and the answer is not hidden. It is written across multiple Mesopotamian texts in language that later traditions worked systematically to obscure. The Sumerians had a word for it. The Akkadians had a story about it. The Hebrew Bible preserved a single compressed reference to it in Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4, and then never mentioned it again. Something had entered the human bloodline that was not supposed to be there, and the flood was sent to wash it out. The Sumerian textual tradition preserves a category of beings called the Apkallu. The term translates as the wise ones or the great ones of water. In the standard scholarly reading, the Apkallu were 7 sages sent by Enki to humanity before the flood to teach the arts of civilization. Temple building, agriculture, divination, metallurgy, medicine, writing, and the interpretation of omens. They appear in the Bit Mesri incantation series in the Uruk list of kings and sages, and in figurine form in Neo-Assyrian palace foundations where they served as protective spirits. The academic consensus treats them as mythological culture heroes, Sumerian equivalents of Prometheus, but the texts themselves describe the Apkallu in terms that the mythological reading has to ignore. The Bit Mesri texts, catalogued and translated by Erika Reiner at the Oriental Institute in 1961, classify the Apkallu into 3 types. The first type is fully divine, sent from the heavens. The second type is described as partially human and partially divine, a hybrid. The third type is fully human but possessing knowledge that originated with the gods. The classification is explicit, it is not metaphorical. The texts use the Akkadian determinative for biological category. The same determinative applied to species of animals to distinguish between these 3 types. The Apkallu were not all the same kind of being. Some of them were mixtures. The second type, the hybrid Apkallu, appears in texts associated with the pre-flood period. They are described as having been born from the union of divine beings and human women. The Akkadian phrase is Ilanu itti sinishtati italkunu, meaning the gods went to the women. This is not allegory in the context of Mesopotamian literature. Mesopotamian scribes distinguished between mythological narrative and administrative record. The Apkallu texts use administrative vocabulary, classification, enumeration, biological category, applied to beings that were, by the scribe's own taxonomy, biologically hybrid. And here is where the contamination reading intersects with the flood narrative. The pre-flood Apkallu did not merely teach humanity. According to the Uruk list of kings and sages, compiled from older sources and preserved on a Seleucid-era tablet now in the Louvre, the Apkallu served as advisors to the pre-flood kings. Each king had an Apkallu assigned to him. The relationship was not spiritual, it was administrative. The Apkallu held positions within the governing structure of pre-flood cities. They had authority, they had influence, and they had offspring. The text does not say the offspring were monstrous, it says they were powerful. The Sumerian term used in related contexts is Nita Kalaga, meaning strong male, a term also applied to warriors and rulers. The implication, distributed across multiple tablets rather than stated in a single dramatic passage, is that by the time of the flood, the pre-flood population contained a lineage that carried divine biological material introduced through the Apkallu, a lineage that had integrated into the power structures of every major city and that had access to knowledge the gods had intended to be controlled. This is the condition that the Eridu fragment may describe with the word that later Akkadian scribes replaced with noise, not acoustic disturbance, biological contamination. A population that had been altered from its original engineered specification, carrying material that Enki had introduced through the Apkallu program, but that Enlil's faction now considered an existential threat. The threat was not that humans were too loud, the threat was that humans were becoming too much like gods. The Atrahasis epic contains a line that most translations render as a theological abstraction, but that reads differently in the original Akkadian. After the flood, when Enlil discovers that Atrahasis survived, he is furious. But his fury is not directed at the survival of humans generally. The text says he is angry because the secret of the gods was disclosed. The Akkadian is Pashitu Sha'ilani, the secret thing of the gods. What secret? In the standard reading, this refers to Enki's warning about the flood. Enki told a human about the god's plan, but the grammar allows another reading. The Peshitu, the secret, could refer not to the warning itself, but to the biological knowledge that Enki embedded in the survivors. The secret of the gods was not that a flood was coming. The secret of the gods was what Enki put on the boat. The text specifies that Atrahasis brought aboard the seed of all living things. The Sumerian cognate is Numun Namlu Ulu, the seed of humanity. But the term Numun in Sumerian administrative text does not mean survivors or refugees. It means genetic stock, breeding material, the biological basis for future generations. Enki did not rescue random families. He selected biological material. He curated what would pass through the flood and what would not. The clean line, the uncontaminated sample, or perhaps, depending on which reading of Enki's motives one accepts, the line that carried exactly the contamination Enlil wanted to destroy, hidden inside the vessel that Enlil's own flood was supposed to make unnecessary. The me, the divine decrees that governed every aspect of civilization, from kingship to brewing to sexual intercourse, were according to multiple Sumerian texts held by the gods and distributed selectively. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes Inanna stealing over 100 me from Enki while he was drunk, transferring them to her city of Uruk. The me were not abstract concepts. They were described as physical objects that could be carried, counted, stolen and stored. If the Apkallu had transmitted me to the pre-flood population, not just taught skills but transferred actual divine instruments of power, then the flood becomes comprehensible as something other than anger, management. It becomes an act of retrieval, destroying the unauthorized copies, eliminating the population that held them, resetting the distribution of power to its intended configuration. and the tablet explains what they were trying to drown. Not people, not cities, not noise, a lineage carrying divine material that could not be recalled. Knowledge embedded in a population that could not be untaught. An unauthorized version of humanity that had diverged from its engineered purpose and acquired capabilities its creators had not sanctioned. The flood was a product recall, and Enki, the original engineer, had already hidden the prototype in a sealed vessel coated with bitumen, floating above the destruction he had been forbidden to prevent, but had quietly ensured would not succeed completely. The question the Atrahasis epic does not answer, and that no subsequent retelling even attempts to ask, is whether the contamination survived the flood, whether what Enlil tried to drown was actually on the boat, whether Enki's preservation protocol was an act of mercy toward humanity, or an act of defiance that ensured the very thing the flood was designed to eliminate would persist into the post-flood world, carried in the seed of all living things, embedded in the biological stock of every human generation that followed. The texts do not confirm this, but the texts do something almost as revealing. They stop talking about it. After the flood, the Apkallu tradition changes. The post-flood sages are no longer hybrid. They are fully human. The biological mixing ends. The divine bloodline disappears from the official record, as if someone edited the next chapter to make it look like the surgery worked. The evidence that the surgery failed is not speculative. It is textual, documented, and distributed across the most authoritative sources in Mesopotamian scholarship. It requires no fringe interpretation to identify. It requires only placing 3 canonical texts side by side and reading what each one removes from the version that came before it. The Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple copies including the Weld Blundell Prism, now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, divides all of recorded history into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. The transition line reads, "The flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. The word that matters is the last one, again. Kingship did not emerge from the survivors. It did not evolve from post-flood social organisation. It descended from heaven a second time, reimposed from above, as if the previous installation had been corrupted and required a clean deployment. The king list treats the flood not as a natural disaster, but as a system partition. Everything before it belongs to one operating environment, everything after it belongs to another. The partition is deliberate, the reinstallation is deliberate, and the word again implies that whatever was installed the first time had been compromised. The pre-flood kings listed on the Weld Blundell Prism reigned for periods that no historian takes literally. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years, Al-Algar, 36,000 years, Enmenlu Anna of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years, 8 kings across 5 cities, total reign of 241,200 years. The standard academic position is that these numbers are symbolic or schematic, representing dynastic prestige rather than actual chronology. But the numbers are precise within the sexagesimal system. Each reign is a clean multiple of 3,600, the Shah, the same unit used in the Lagash tablet for population counts. The scribes were not inventing large numbers for rhetorical effect. They were applying a counting system to a category of ruler whose temporal scale did not fit human lifespans. The pre-flood kings were not human kings. They were something else. And after the flood, the reign lengths collapse. Post-flood kings reign for centuries, then decades, then years. The transition from pre-flood to post-flood on the king list is a transition from one type of ruler to another, as if the flood eliminated the category of being that had governed previously, and replaced it with ordinary humans operating under reinstalled divine authority. Now, place the Atrahasis epic beside the king list. The Atrahasis describes humanity created to serve the gods, then growing too numerous and too something, noisy in the Akkadian, contaminated in the possible Sumerian reading. The flood is sent. One man survives with curated biological stock. After the flood, the gods impose new limits on humanity. Infant mortality, barrenness, celibate priestesses. The text explicitly describes these as population controls installed after the flood that did not exist before it. The post-flood world has constraints the pre-flood world lacked. This is not punishment continuing. This is a patched system designed to prevent recurrence of whatever condition triggered the flood. Now place the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, beside the Atrahasis. The Gilgamesh flood account, written in Akkadian and preserved on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, dated to the 7th century BCE but copied from Old Babylonian originals, reproduces the Atrahasis narrative with one critical alteration. The Gilgamesh version removes the Apkallu entirely. There are no hybrid sages, there is no discussion of pre-flood biological mixing, there is no contamination, there is only Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, who is granted immortality by the gods after the waters recede. In the Gilgamesh version, the flood is a mistake the gods regret. Ishtar weeps, Enlil is chastened. The event is reframed from a targeted operation into a tragedy of divine overreaction. The editorial trajectory is consistent. Each retelling removes one layer of specificity. The Eridugenesis contains the oldest and most specific vocabulary. The Atrahasis keeps the structure but substitutes noise for contamination. The Gilgamesh version removes the Apkallu, removes the biological dimension, and reframes the flood as regrettable divine excess, and then the Hebrew Bible completes the process. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 compress the entire Mesopotamian tradition into a monotheistic moral framework. One God, one righteous man, one judgment against human wickedness. The council is gone, the factions are gone, Enki is gone, Enlil is gone, the Apkallu are gone. But Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 preserves a single compressed fragment of the older story that the editors could not fully remove or chose to leave as a vestige. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. The Hebrew term Nephilim has been debated for millennia. It may derive from Nephil, to fall, suggesting fallen ones. The passage describes divine human interbreeding producing a race of mighty ones, men of renown, and then immediately in verse 5, God sees the wickedness of man and decides to send the flood. The juxtaposition is not accidental. The biblical editors placed the Nephilim passage directly before the flood decree. The contamination and the decision to destroy are presented in sequence, cause and effect, even though the monotheistic framework prevents the text from explaining the connection the way the Sumerian and Akkadian originals did. The Nephilim are the last visible trace of the Apkallu tradition in the transmitted text. Everything else was edited out. The council, the factions, the biological taxonomy, the deliberate preservation protocol, the post-flood population controls, all removed, replaced with a morality narrative in which God punishes sin and rewards righteousness. The simplest version, the cleanest version, and the version most distant from what the oldest tablet actually says, the Book of 1st Enoch, excluded from the Hebrew and most Christian canons but preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and confirmed by fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, provides the material the biblical editors removed. The Watchers, a class of divine beings, descend to earth, take human wives, produce hybrid offspring called Nephilim, and teach humanity forbidden arts including metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, and weapons. God sends the flood to destroy the Nephilim and punish the Watchers. The parallel with the Apkallu tradition is exact. Divine beings descend, they interbreed, they teach forbidden knowledge. The flood is sent to eliminate the results. The Book of Enoch preserves the Mesopotamian structure that Genesis compressed into 4 verses. Not divine wrath against human sin, not punishment for noise, not a storm that got out of hand. A targeted elimination of a hybrid population carrying divine biological material and forbidden knowledge, executed by one faction of a governing council over the objection of another, with the dissenting faction secretly preserving a curated remnant that may or may not have carried the very contamination the flood was designed to destroy. This reading is not fringe. It is the reading that emerges when the texts are placed in chronological order and the editorial deletions are mapped. The fringe position is the one that ignores the oldest sources and treats the most recent, most simplified retelling as the original. The flood story was not simplified because it was improved. It was simplified because someone, across 2,000 years of editorial transmission, was still trying to erase the same thing the flood was sent to erase. Almost. The editorial trajectory from Sumerian to Hebrew spans approximately 1,500 years of continuous transmission, and at every stage the same elements disappear. Mapping the deletions is not controversial. It is the ordinary work of comparative textual scholarship, the kind performed in every graduate seminar on ancient Near Eastern literature. What is controversial is asking why the deletions follow such a consistent pattern, and why the elements removed are always the same ones. The Eridu-Genesis, circa 1600 BCE, Sumerian, contains the oldest flood vocabulary, including the contested term pointing to contamination rather than noise, contains references to pre-flood civilization with divine governance, fragmentary but specific where legible. The Atrahasis epic, circa 1700 BCE in its Old Babylonian recension, Akkadian, retains the divine council, the factional debate, the creation of humanity as engineered labour, the escalating population reduction attempts, and the post-flood imposition of biological controls. Replaces the Sumerian contamination vocabulary with Hebrew noise, removes the biological taxonomy of the Apkallu. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, standardized circa 1200 BCE, Neo-Assyrian library copies from the 7th century BCE, removes the Apkallu entirely, removes the divine creation of humanity as context, removes the post-flood population controls, reframes the flood as a divine error that the gods themselves regret, reduces the political complexity of the council to a single emotional scene. Genesis 6 through 9, compiled between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE, Hebrew, removes the council, removes Enki and Enlil as separate agents, collapses the factional structure into a single omnipotent deity, removes the engineered labour origin of humanity, removes every trace of the Apkallu except 4 verses describing the Nephilim, placed immediately before the flood decree and never explained, replaces targeted erasure with moral judgment, replaces biological contamination with wickedness. Each retelling removes the same category of information, the hybrid beings, the divine human interbreeding, the biological dimension of the pre-flood crisis, the factional disagreement over whether the contamination should be destroyed or preserved. Every version keeps the flood, every version keeps the single survivor, every version keeps the boat. The structure survives because the structure is safe. What is stripped away consistently across every culture that inherited the story is the reason. This pattern has been documented in comparative studies but is rarely interpreted as deliberate editorial policy. The standard academic position treats the simplification as natural cultural drift. Stories lose complexity as they travel, details fall away, mythological frameworks adapt to new theological systems. This is true of most transmitted narratives, but most transmitted narratives do not lose the same details in the same order across every transmission path. The flood story does not simplify randomly, it simplifies directionally. The vector of simplification points consistently away from the biological reading and toward the moral one, away from contamination and toward punishment, away from a targeted operation and toward universal divine wrath. Someone was editing, and they were editing toward the same conclusion that Enlil reached in the council chamber. The contamination should not be discussed. The hybrid lineage should not be remembered. The reason for the flood should be replaced with something simpler, something that does not raise the questions the original account raises. The academic cost of pursuing this reading in a professional context is well documented by its absence. No tenured Assyriologist has published a paper arguing that the Sumerian flood tradition describes a targeted biological erasure. The textual evidence is available. The comparative analysis is straightforward. The Apkallu taxonomy is published and translated. The Nephilim parallel is acknowledged in every serious commentary on Genesis 6, but the synthesis, the argument that these elements form a coherent narrative of deliberate genetic intervention, hybrid contamination and targeted destruction, does not appear in any peer-reviewed journal, not because it has been refuted, because it has not been proposed. The professional incentive structure in ancient Near Eastern studies does not reward this kind of synthesis. It punishes it. A scholar who published this argument in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies would not be refuted, they would be ignored, which in academic terms is worse. The traces that survive are not hidden. They are catalogued, translated and publicly available. The Weld-Blundell prism is in Oxford. CBS 10673 is in Philadelphia. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. The Bitmesri incantation texts with their 3-tier Apkallu classification are published in Reiner's 1961 edition. The Uruk list of kings and sages is in the Louvre. The Dead Sea Scroll fragments of 1st Enoch are in Jerusalem. The texts exist, the translations exist. The divergences between versions are documented in peer-reviewed literature dating back over a century. Nothing described in these tablets is secret. Everything is accessible to anyone with a university library card and the patience to read Akkadian in transliteration. What does not exist is the synthesis. The single document that places the Eridu Genesis beside the Atrahasis, beside the Gilgamesh, beside Genesis, beside 1st Enoch, and asks the question that the editorial trajectory itself poses. If each retelling removes the biological dimension, what was the biological dimension? If the oldest version uses a word meaning contamination, where every later version substitutes noise or sin, what was the contamination? If the pre-flood Apkallu were classified by Mesopotamian scribes as biologically hybrid, using as administrative taxonomy, and if the flood immediately follows the period of their activity, and if the post-flood Apkallu are reclassified as fully human, then what happened to the hybrid component? The flood happened to it. That is what the texts say, not what scholars have argued the texts imply. What the texts, read in chronological order with their editorial deletions and mapped, actually describe: if the flood was targeted, the target was a bloodline. If the bloodline was hybrid, the source was divine. If the source was divine but unauthorized, then the flood was not wrath, it was correction. If Enki preserved a curated biological sample on the boat, the question is whether the sample was clean, or whether Enki, the original engineer, the dissenting faction member who designed humanity and introduced the Apkallu, ensured that the contamination survived inside the vessel that was supposed to carry only the uncontaminated remnant. If the contamination survived, then the flood failed. And if the flood failed, then everything that followed, the reinstalled kingship, the shortened lifespans, the imposed population controls, the 1500 years of editorial deletion, was not theology, it was containment. The tablets sit in museums in Oxford, Philadelphia, London, Paris, and Baghdad. The transliterations are published, the Sumerian is readable, the editorial trajectory from the oldest version to the newest is documented and undisputed. The pre-flood Apkallu were classified as hybrid. The post-flood Apkallu were reclassified as human. Between those two classifications, a flood erased everything on the surface of the earth. The oldest account says the flood was sent to eliminate a contamination. Every subsequent account replaced that word with something less specific, something safer. Something that did not require asking what the contamination was, where it came from, or whether it survived. The flood was not sent to erase humanity. Humanity was the medium in which something else was growing. The flood was sent to erase that something else. And the question the tablets raise, sitting in their climate-controlled cases behind glass in 6 museums across 4 continents, is whether the erasure worked, whether what the waters were sent to drown actually drowned, or whether it floated, sealed in bitumen, carrying the seed of all living things into the world that came after. The oldest version of the story says what the flood was for. Every version that followed tried to bury the answer. The tablets, like the thing they describe, survived.